from New York's JFK airport.
Couldn't get out of the house fast enough. Couldn't wait to get to the airport.
21-year-old Nicole was returning after 6 months abroad.
A Pan Am 747 carrying about 250
We weren't
people.
really listening to anything in particular, but I heard about a plane missing over Scotland.
On the other side of the Atlantic, fires burned in a small Scottish town.
And then we went and inquired, and the gentleman said that Pan Am 103 has been lost. I collapsed at the airport. I was screaming, "My baby, my baby."
On a dark December night in 1988, one of the worst aircraft disasters in history occurred in the skies over Scotland. A Boeing 747 aircraft broke apart at 31,000 feet with 259 people on board. Seconds later, the peace of a rural Scottish town was shattered. Large sections of jumbo jet smashed into residential streets, bringing fire and death on an unimaginable scale. The town's name was Lockerbie. The shocking aftermath of the crash was captured on video camera. Much of this footage has never been broadcast before. This is the story of Lockerbie, told by those who were there and those whose lives it tore apart.
Horrific. It was a horrific scene.
The whole street was gone. The whole street was on fire.
It is one of those nights one will never forget.
Praying with all my might that this wasn't happening.
Said the Lord's Prayer as I thought we were going to die.
It was an event that shocked the world and would forever change the way we travel. The small town of Lockerbie is located in the Scottish borders. It's a peaceful, rural corner of the country. Lockerbie sits on the M74, the main north-south route linking Scotland and England. For many, the town is just a sign off the road.
A sleepy Scottish hillside town. Very welcoming place.
A very quiet market town where very little happened, to be honest with you.
The youngsters used to complain about there was nothing going on. You know, even going 12 miles to Dumfries was a big adventure.
I knew where Scotland was, but and Edinburgh perhaps, Glasgow, but Lockerbie was just beyond my understanding.
In 1988, Father Patrick Keegans was the local Catholic priest. He lived at number 1 Sherwood Crescent, a small street on the edge of Lockerbie. That Christmas, his mother was staying with him and had arrived on the afternoon of December the 21st.
And I was looking forward to Christmas because Christmas in a small place is different from the city. There's a sort of quaintness and a real joy about Christmas.
Local schoolteacher Helen Fraser also lived on Sherwood Crescent. Helen, her husband and 2 children lived at number 29.
It was the first day of the school holidays, and I'd been teaching. The children and I went to do some bits and pieces of Christmas shopping. And we came back and we put up the Christmas decorations.
As locals prepared for Christmas, they could have no idea that within hours their small town would become a household name and a symbol of worldwide tragedy. At London's busiest airport, Heathrow, passengers were arriving to catch flights before the Christmas holidays. Businessman Frank Chula was traveling to New Jersey to spend Christmas with his family.
He didn't have to do anything when he came home. I even bought the sausage for the sauce, which was very important in our family. In fact, you know, I made sure that day, the 21st, I went out and made sure I had that in the house in case he wanted to make it that night.
So my dad's big thing that he loved to do was go shopping on Christmas Eve. And that's insane. Like, no one likes to go Christmas shopping on Christmas Eve, and he loved it. And so he would save all my mom's presents for Christmas Eve. And for a couple of years, I did the shopping with him because I thought it was a really miraculous process because he would just go this, and just buy all of this stuff for my mom.
Also arriving at Heathrow that day were 35 American students, members of a study abroad program run by Syracuse University. Among the 35 was politics student J.P. Flynn. J.P. was an accomplished athlete.
Tennis was his best sport. He was first singles all the time, okay? Even when he was a little kid, he would jump all the way up to first singles. The one he loved the most was basketball because of the team spirit and the team playing and so forth.
Traveling with J.P. that day was his friend, Tom Schultz. Tom's mum, Jane, had visited him in Europe a month before.
When I walked into the kitchen, he said, "Oh, Ma, you're going to love it because we cleaned up the apartment for you." Well, cleaning up meant stacking about 1,000 pizza boxes in the corner. He had his hair cut real short, and he had it spiked. And I didn't say anything, and I knew he was just dying for me to say something about it. So after half an hour, he couldn't stand it, and he said, "Well, what do you think, Ma?" And I said, "All I can say is, I'm glad your father isn't here."
Among the many departures that day was Pan American 103, a non-stop transatlantic flight from London to New York. Booked on board Flight 103 was Nicole Boulanger, a musical drama student at Syracuse.
She loved fashion. They often describe Nicole as being able to put on a paper bag with accessories and looking like $1 million. She absolutely adored consignment shops, where she could endeavor to find the most interesting things, yet put together an outfit that most of us would be shocked to see, because how did she do that?
At Heathrow, those boarding Flight 103 in London went through the normal check-in and security procedures. Their aircraft, a Pan Am jumbo jet named Clipper Made of the Seas, was having baggage loaded on board and being readied for the transatlantic flight. Once every passenger was accounted for, the Clipper Made of the Seas left its stand and taxied for takeoff. What no one on board knew was that there was a brown suitcase in the hold which did not belong to anyone on the plane. Once in the air, Pan Am 103 headed north. The journey to New York would take some 7 hours. The 747 reached its cruising speed at an altitude of 31,000 feet. On board the flight were 243 passengers and 16 crew members. Sitting in the first-class cabin was businessman Frank Chula.
I remember this one time where he came to the local pool and he was dressed in the most atrocious outfit with a cowboy hat, and everyone just thought he was like the coolest guy in the whole world, and of course I was so embarrassed.
Drama student Nicole Boulanger was sitting over the wings in seat 28B.
She had so many, many, many friends. And actually, Nicole was not fully aware of how much talent she actually had.
Keen athlete J.P. Flynn was sitting in window seat 45A, towards the rear of the plane.
Even though he was a very good athlete, He pushed his academics just as hard. He wanted to succeed at both.
Sitting on the aisle, one seat from JP, was his friend, Tom Schultz.
He was very good at arguing a point and usually won his arguments, so he had definitely the Irish, the gift of gab.
25 minutes into its journey, Flight 103 crossed into Scottish airspace and was about to turn west towards the eastern seaboard of the United States. The plane made contact with Prestwick Air Traffic Control. This was the last communication between the ground and the plane. 46 seconds after 7:02, Pan Am 103 disappeared from air traffic control radar screens.
It just lit up with white light.
And then the whole sky turned orange.
The whole house went dark, and the house shook so much it was impossible to move.
And then things just started to fall out of the sky, stone and debris all round about us.
And I thought, I'm going to die here, and then everything went still.
I ran downstairs and the children came running from the kitchen, and I just grabbed them and we sat in the corner of the hall and said the Lord's Prayer, as I thought we were going to die.
Helen Fraser's house was just a few hundred feet from a huge impact crater. Within minutes, emergency calls reached the fire service. Their response was captured on radio.
Multiple fires, casualties unknown. Main Street, Lockerbie, over.
Officer 1 to fire control, roger.
Then I opened up the front door, and the whole street was gone. The whole street was on fire. There was fires in the garden and rubble and debris everywhere.
Father Patrick Keegans and his mother were incredibly lucky to have survived. Number 1 Sherwood Crescent was just a short distance from the now blazing crater.
And I said to my mother, we've got to leave. So I got her ready as best I could and put a scarf over her mouth and wrapped her up, and I put on a big jacket and boots and corduroy trousers. And I said, we'll leave now, but don't look at anything, don't look, just keep your eyes down. So she kept her eyes down, and I took her through all this rubble.
Everything was on fire. The streets were burning, the trees were burning, there were small fires and big fires.
Sherwood Crescent had been hit by the central wing section of the plane, which included the fuel tanks. Thousands of gallons of aviation fuel had exploded, obliterating 5 houses, home to 2 families with children, a married couple, and 2 elderly people.
I think that the blessing would be that those who did die would have died very quickly, and probably wouldn't have known very much about it. I hope they didn't.
In the first minutes, there was confusion among the emergency services about what had happened.
Serious gas explosion. Doctor and ambulance required. Over.
Fire officer Alan Riddett happened to be in Lockerbie by chance that night.
We just started running up and got pretty well up the street towards the crater site and realised it was bad. You knew it was something big when there was black smoke to that extent in the open.
Local newspaper photographer Robin Bryden was one of the first members of the press to arrive.
You couldn't really see a great deal because of all the smoke. You could certainly smell the fuel, and there's lots of people running around shouting for relatives. Walked onto the road, it was closed off, and walked down there and started taking the photographs because you could see the burning houses.
As I was walking up the street, the fires were breaking out in front of me and behind me, and I was frightened, you know. I was saying to myself, well, maybe get caught in something here. So I was tempted just to come back.
There was nothing we could do here at all. I mean, absolutely nothing. The guy behind me, we started running across the fields to the houses. You know, I mean, the 1 or 2 houses were totally engulfed again, nothing you could do. But the ones on the outskirts, you know, there was obviously hope, you know.
It was clear to many on the scene that this was some sort of plane crash, but they knew little else.
When a reasonable number of firefighters arrived on scene and we started to try and tackle the fire, then the water system failed. We quickly realised that one of the engines had fallen down through the water main, so it became quite a difficult incident to deal with because we had a major fire and not a lot of water.
What we're doing at the moment is we're doing a reconnaissance of the area. We're reporting back to the control unit to update the picture that's emerging there.
The fire, to a large extent, was the least of the problems. I mean, the biggest concern was about were there any survivors, how could we help them.
News that a passenger jet had crashed quickly spread across the country. Journalists and TV crews rushed to the scene.
The phone rang in the newsroom, and we were all there having a party. And the news came through that something had happened, a plane had downed. We realised immediately that we should go very, very quickly.
In the United States, news reports began to filter through to families.
I was listening to the radio, the news, and they told me about a plane going down.
A jumbo jet went down over Scotland, hit a petrol station on fire. Now, I knew my husband was coming home, but it didn't give you the name, you know, the Pan Am or American, whatever. So I was a little nervous. I turned around, and the second time he came on, he did say Pan Am. Not 103, but he did say a Pan Am jet. And I think that's when my stomach just kind of sank.
News of the events in Lockerbie reached a government in Westminster.
I was in the House of Commons and I got a message saying that there had been an explosion, that a Pan Am aircraft had crashed, there had been some sort of explosion in the sky, and at that stage nobody yet knew anything else.
In Lockerbie, hundreds of off-duty police officers rushed to the scene, including 21-year-old Kate Thompson.
I do remember being in the car with my colleagues making our way, and we were just south of Lockerbie, and we could see in the distance flames, and another colleague from the service came across our radios and said, "I found the cockpit and it says made of the seas."
The discovery of the cockpit was a crucial moment. The emergency services on the ground now knew that this was a 747 jumbo jet, and they knew there would be hundreds of casualties. The cockpit was in fact lying some 3 miles from the centre of Lockerbie. It was clear from this point on that wreckage hadn't just hit the town, it was scattered for miles.
You could hear two-tone sirens, you could see flames, you could see there was smoke. But along with that, there was actually peace. It was a strange kind of silence in places.
It seemed to me that the place was stunned. It felt as if the physical area of the town was just, the whole thing was just completely stunned.
At the local hospital, doctors and nurses were called back to work, and emergency medical supplies and blood arrived. The medical staff prepared to deal with hundreds of casualties. Specialists like RAF Mountain Rescue team leader David Wally also began to arrive.
When I arrived at Lockerbie, well, all the way down you could see wreckage in the road. The smell of fuel, aviation fuel, absolutely stank. I'd never smelt it so heavy in the air, and the fires were just a Dante's Inferno. It was horrific. It was a horrific scene.
It wasn't just aircraft wreckage scattered around, but the remnants of human life.
And we went round, and within 5 minutes we knew we could do nothing. You know, it was mayhem. And, you know, without saying too much, you know, there was bodies everywhere, there was Christmas presents everywhere. Everybody that we could see was dead.
The many ambulances that had arrived in Lockerbie stood idle. There were very few wounded among the local people. And at the hospital, staff were still expecting many casualties from the aircraft to arrive.
There have been no survivors reported from the crashed aircraft, and we're waiting for Dr. Hill, who's the on-site medical officer, to give us an official stand down.
On the other side of the Atlantic, relatives of the victims began to arrive at JFK Airport, many not aware that Flight 103 would never land. Among them was Janine Boulanger and her husband.
I collapsed at the airport, and I remember being on the ground trying to get up, and I was just surrounded. People were right on top of me with cameras and bright lights. It was the worst moment that one could possibly have experienced.
Other relatives would also hear the terrible news that afternoon. 17-year-old Michelle Chula was told to return home from school.
When I walked in the house, at that point, my mother was on the floor crying and screaming, and my sister was still in her coat, and so I knew like things were happening really fast. And I remember at that time going into a room, not even saying anything to them, going into the room and just praying, and praying with all my might that this wasn't happening.
Parents are supposed to protect their children, and at that moment I realized that we could not have provided that for her.
Even now, a few hours after the tragedy of Pan Am Flight 103, the full extent of the disaster has not been assessed. All around are fragments of the aircraft's fuselage. Helicopters hover overhead with powerful searchlights as the grim search for bodies continues.
One of those walking the hills that night was police surgeon David Fieldhouse.
We met up with one of those chaps with his dog, and he had found locations where there were bodies. And when the number got to about 10 or 11, we decided that we ought to go back and label every one of them, because we hadn't expected that sort of number. And we labelled them, well, I labelled them with my initials DCF1, and eventually up to 58.
Around midnight, Scottish Secretary Malcolm Rifkind arrived in Lockerbie.
When we first arrived, I was taken a tour of the site. There was, sadly, artifacts on the ground, a shoe, a handbag, various elements of personal property, which had just fallen from the sky. When one went to the first location, where there's a massive crater in the ground caused by the impact of the fuselage, the house is totally destroyed. Clearly, it must have been an enormously devastating event.
As the news was officially confirmed that a jumbo jet had broken apart in mid-air, the first thoughts were not of a terrorist attack.
When we first heard that the event started at 31,000 feet or around there, we worried about the integrity of the aircraft, frankly. The 747 wasn't a brand new design. It had never broken up in flight before, but if it was a mechanical malfunction or some kind of a structural failure, that would affect all the other 747s out there, perhaps.
If this was a structural failure, it could prove catastrophic for the airline industry. Across the globe, thousands of passengers would be stranded just days before Christmas. In the early hours of the morning, the authorities called a press conference. Scottish Secretary Malcolm Rifkind and the US Ambassador Charles Price addressed the waiting media.
It is one of those nights one will never forget. It's clearly been an appalling disaster.
Tragedies of this nature are impossible to predict. It's just a most unfortunate and incredible situation. And we're very, very sorry.
Nearly 10 hours after Flight 103 hit Lockerbie, the authorities still had very few answers.
You couldn't just say no comment to every single question. You couldn't just say, sorry, I can't help you, but quite often you had to say that. It is certainly the case that the aircraft clearly experienced some form of explosion which has resulted in many parts of the aircraft falling in different locations. That we know. But what might have caused that to happen, I'm sorry, I could not even speculate.
There was a huge sense of frustration, I thought, because we couldn't know. We didn't know what had happened. We didn't know whether it had been a massive engine explosion, engine failure, pilot error, a bomb. Nobody knew. And as a journalist, when there's so little you can say and so little that you can report, that is very frustrating.
Scattered in and around Lockerbie were the bodies of the 259 people on board Pan Am Flight 103. Many of these victims would be found over the next few hours, but some would never be identified.
My husband brought back some policemen, I think, at 3, 4 in the morning. And I think they saw off quite a lot of the Christmas brandy at that time, because I think my husband said that these men had seen things that they should never have seen, sights that just were awful.
It was a harrowing time for all the local people, and all the volunteers were there, because I don't think anybody, including me, has seen anything quite as severe as that before.
The full horror of Lockerbie would only emerge as the sun rose at daybreak. As dawn broke on the 22nd of December, the full extent of the disaster became clear. In Sherwood Crescent, 5 homes had been completely destroyed. 11 local residents were missing. The wreckage of Pan Am 103 was scattered over 845 square miles, and all of the 259 people on board had lost their lives.
And at first light, we had all the guys, about 200 of us, and we did a sweep around the areas that we'd found stuff, and we knew what we were looking for, because the recce boys had come back and said, engines here, fuselage here, and by first light we'd found a black box, and we'd located about 160 fatalities, which is incomprehensible.
The remains of Pan Am 103 could be seen all over the town. At Rosebank, a large section of fuselage containing 61 individuals had devastated several houses. At Sherwood Crescent, there was a huge crater where 5 houses had been. 2 engines had also hit the town and buried themselves in the ground. And the jumbo jet's cockpit was lying in a field some 3 miles from the centre of Lockerbie.
It was really strange because, of course, it was like the dawning of a new day, and yet it was really not. It was kind of the horror of the night was just becoming a little bit clearer.
I always remember coming in and there was still that air of smoke, you know, that was just lurking. But by then Sherwood Crescent all the fires had been put out, and Park Place had been sealed off, and they were obviously dealing with that. But by then they'd started to arrange a lot of the searches of the hills, over the hill towards where the cockpit was.
From the first hours of the emergency response, the disaster was treated as a criminal investigation. Every victim and piece of wreckage was painstakingly recorded and catalogued. This small Scottish town had become the focus of the world's media.
This is a very close rural community. Naturally, people are reluctant to talk about what's happened. People obviously at the moment still don't know whether their friends and neighbours have been involved. There are still a number of local people missing, and we don't have any accurate figures on that.
For Lockerbie, it must have been bewildering to have all these big vans trundling in, you know, reporters everywhere swarming over the place. But they were incredibly generous and incredibly hospitable.
It was a sense of being in an unreal world. The first day, when I saw TV crews and cameras and journalists. So it was like being in a dream.
In Sherwood Crescent, the residents saw the human cost of the tragedy firsthand.
And there was bits of stuff lying everywhere. And there was this piece of, I don't know what it was sort of greyish, pinkish, big sort of lump. And maybe 10 inches by 8 inches, that sort of size. And I kind of looked at it closely. And then I realised it was a big piece of skin. And I thought, oh, God. I didn't really look very closely at anything after that. And there was a Bible lying beside it. Just the pages were fluttering.
Some 17 hours after the event, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher arrived in Lockerbie to see the disaster for herself.
She did more or less the same tour that I had done, including the visit to Lockerbie itself.
It is very moving indeed, because there are a lot of personal possessions that you can see scattered about.
And I think she also made a point of wishing to go to all the people who had volunteered during the night to help with coffee, with sandwiches, with medical support, with psychological support, just to express thanks on behalf of the country.
And we must our American friends will remember us, and we must remember their grief too.
It's very nice of you to come.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The rescue workers were a bit annoyed because they had to stop working when these dignitaries descended, and at that time they were still hoping they might find somebody alive, and of course they didn't.
In total, 11 local people had lost their lives, all of them residents of Sherwood Crescent. Many of their bodies were never found, due to the force of the explosion.
But you don't expect this to happen in a rural village in Scotland at Christmas. And Christmas was a big thing as well. Teddy bears and Christmas presents. It's hard, very hard.
We had a lot of bits which we didn't know about until a policeman came and knocked at the door. So he had a quick look, and then he came back and he said, "You've got a few bits of human remains around." I went and picked some Christmas roses that we had growing, and I put a rose. Sorry. I put a rose at each piece. Said a wee prayer. Kind of pointless thing to do, really, but I just felt I couldn't not do anything.
Hundreds of police officers, soldiers and accident investigators were ordered to comb the countryside around Lockerbie. They needed to locate thousands of pieces of wreckage, the missing bodies, and any clues that could help explain what had brought down Pan Am 103. 72 hours after the incident, FBI explosives expert Tom Thurman was called to a meeting with the lead accident investigator and asked to examine a strange piece of wreckage.
He said, "This has been segregated out from a lot of things that we're finding out in the fields, and that it appears to be different." And I looked at it closer and closer, and I said, okay, based upon a quick visual at this point, which would have to be confirmed by absolutely a laboratory examination, this appears to be direct result of high explosives. There was a silence.
The explosive device had been in one of the plane's baggage containers. This discovery changed everything. From this point on, Lockerbie was an international criminal investigation. But it would take several days for tests to confirm it was in fact a bomb, and a shocking act of terror. Christmas 1988 was a difficult time for those in Lockerbie.
I couldn't say Christmas Mass. I couldn't do the midnight Mass. So I got the bishop to do it. Bishop Taylor came and did it. And I said, I'll just cry my way through this. So he said, you could do one prayer. I said, okay, I'll do one prayer. I got maybe 6 or 7 words out, and that was it. Just the tears came.
The grief of those in Scotland was shared by those in the United States who had lost their loved ones.
I remember Christmas Day just being the 4 of us, and it was the first time our house had been empty since it happened, and realizing that everyone else was with their family and that this was really our loss. Like, even if people care about us, even if people help us, support us, this was ours, and we were going to need to deal with it. That was really eye-opening.
Everybody
just came
and cried with us.
Mm-hmm.
And
our whole family was there.
In our memory of JP.
Mm-hmm.
So I forgot that.
No, everybody was there.
It was a non-existing time in many ways. And there was an empty chair at the table.
The investigators called a press conference. It would end speculation about what had caused the disaster.
It has been established that 2 parts of the metal luggage pallet framework show conclusive evidence of a detonating high explosive.
It was later established that an unaccompanied suitcase containing an explosive device had been transferred onto the plane at Heathrow.
A reporter came up to me and said, "We've just gotten the news, it's just come over television, that it was a terrorist bomb that brought the plane down."
A bomb. A young woman and many other wonderful people on that plane. Adults, very young children. Blown up in the air for what?
In the months after the disaster, investigators pieced together thousands of fragments of evidence. They discovered that the bomb had been placed in a Samsonite suitcase. This bag had been transferred into the Pan Am baggage system from an Air Malta flight at Frankfurt Airport.
We did know we were in for a very long investigation. It's tough when you have a murder. It's harder when the murder could have happened literally anywhere in the world, and the people that perpetrated that murder were unknown and could be who knew where at that point in time.
One of the hardest things, I suppose, was the early funerals. That was hard. Because the first funeral was Joanne Flanagan. She was only 10. And that funeral was here. I was conducting the funeral. I didn't feel very strong.
When identification had been confirmed, the bodies of the victims were returned in early January 1989. In the United States, some of the families came to the airport to meet the bodies of their loved ones.
A forklift lifted out the coffins one by one, and there they are dangling up in the sky. And each family had a hearse there waiting to take the body. It was like they were handling a piece of cargo. It was terrible.
Tom Schultz had died just days before his 21st birthday.
It was a horrible experience, going to pick up your son's dead body. And as I said before, everybody was so sorrowful and crying and so on and so forth. So we went through a long period of sorrow. And a long period to this day, still sorrowful. We still cry a lot.
J.P. Flynn would have celebrated his 46th birthday in 2013.
Frank was returned home on the Concorde through the bank. And naturally, they cremated him in London and all. And on the plane, they knew the story. And which I thought was the nicest thing I heard at that time, was that they all toasted him with champagne.
Cole's body was not recovered. There were body parts that were recovered for which they could not assign an identity. So that all of these were buried in one simple grave in the Lockerbie Cemetery with a headstone of those whose remains could not be identified, Nicole being one of them.
The remains of 17 individuals who could never be identified lie in the Lockerbie Cemetery. The tragedy that unfolded in Lockerbie had an immediate effect on international travel. In the United States, a presidential commission examining the events made 60 recommendations to tighten airport security. Bags were no longer allowed to travel without an accompanying passenger, and bag searches became more rigorous.
Air travel really isn't that pleasant experience, and Lockerbie was pretty much the first step in that, I think. There had been bombings before, but Lockerbie was the eye-opener.
In the year 2000, at a specially convened Scottish court sitting in the Netherlands, Libyan nationals Abdel Basset al-Magrahi and Al-Amin Khalifa Fahima were tried for 270 counts of murder. The trial lasted 9 months. Al-Magrahi alone was found guilty and sentenced to 27 years in jail. In 2003, Colonel Gaddafi's Libyan regime agreed to pay $2.7 billion in compensation to the families of Pan Am 103 victims. In 2008, Al-Magrahi was diagnosed with terminal cancer and released on compassionate grounds the following year. He died in May 2012.
If those who've died were able to speak to us just now, what would they say? And they would tell us, live your lives joyfully, because that's how we want you to live your lives. Because in the back of my head too, there was this thought, we're not going to allow the terrorists to have our lives as well.
The world is full of hate and terror, and I've decided that I need to concentrate on the goodness that surrounds us and the beauty of life. Because I don't think my daughter would want anything else.